All right, Alexander. So we had Joe Biden yesterday in a press conference where he called Peter Ducey an SOB, a hot mic moment, but not really a hot mic moment. He knew what he was saying.
No,
I
absolutely.
mean, he's losing it. He's losing it. But the question was about inflation, or at least the question that Peter Ducey was going to ask or trying to ask was about inflation. I believe I'm paraphrasing it, or maybe I'm getting it exactly right. I think the question was something like, "Do you consider what's happening with inflation to be a political cost?" Something along those lines. Like, is the inflation gonna be a political cost to you? And then Biden called him an SOB, and they tried to talk to him about Russia. He says no questions on Russia because I guess he hasn't been coached and scripted. But anyway, inflation. That was the
Infl-
question that Biden did not want to answer. That was the question that
yeah.
triggered Biden to call Ducey an SOB. Obviously, it's eating away at the Biden White House. What's going on?
My own impression was that Biden came to that press conference. Things are not going to plan. They're obviously not going to plan on the inflation front, but they're not going to plan either on the Ukraine-Russia front also, because he came to that conference after having this meeting, this video conference with various European leaders to discuss the Ukraine issue. And he said, I'm going to quote, he said, I had a very, very good meeting, total unanimity with all the European leaders. We'll talk about it later. And then he gets questions, and then he refuses to discuss that. So clearly the meeting didn't go as well as he said it had. Clearly there was less than total unanimity. That was, of course, Ukraine. And then he really blew up when, as you rightly said, the really, really big issue, the one that's eating away at him, came out. And the question was, will you take questions on inflation then? In other words, you're not talking about Ukraine, you're not talking about Russia. Will you talk about inflation? Do you think inflation is a political liability ahead of the midterms? And now I'm reading from the presidential website, from the White House's own website. You have him explode. He said, no, it's a great asset. More inflation. What a stupid son of a bitch. That's the President of the United States. That's the President of the United States talking to journalists in that way. I mean, it's just astonishing. I mean, imagine if Donald Trump had spoken like that to the media. You can just imagine what the headlines would be. But it shows how rattled he's getting. He's obviously not getting the unanimity from European leaders that he wanted, but that's a secondary issue. For him, inflation is the big hot topic issue. He's clearly aware. That's what his words say. He's clearly aware that his poll ratings are tanking, that his party's poll ratings are tanking, that the midterms are about to be lost, and he clearly understands that the inflation fire that he has lit is becoming increasingly dangerous to his administration, to the Democratic Party, and of course ultimately to his own position. And he's responding to it in the usual angry way that people who have their back to the wall and who are getting very stressed always respond. And of course, what must be looming on the horizon is that within a couple of days, we're going to have a decision from the Federal Reserve Board about whether they're going to put up interest rates. If those interest rates go up, it's because the Federal Reserve Board has been forced to take action to control, to put out, if you like, this inflation fire that Biden himself has lit with this reckless overspending that he engaged in at the start of last year. And the risk that he's running, that the administration is facing, that the Democratic Party is facing, is that with interest rates rising, that will cause a downturn in the economy, perhaps a recession in the run-up, in the lead-up to the November midterms, which, to be very clear, if they result in the kind of wipeout that one would certainly see if there was a recession in the lead-up to them, well, that would in effect be the de facto end of his administration. So he's clearly stressed, he's clearly worried, he sees the events around the world in stock markets. Stock markets in the US are all falling. Everybody's getting very nervous because they're worrying about what the Fed is going to do. And the Fed, for its part, is under enormous pressure. Does it raise interest rates, precipitate a recession, cause perhaps problems in the financial system, which it has allowed to get out of control by allowing, booms to continue, bubbles to continue for so long? Does the Fed take the step of raising interest rates, or does it bottle out of that by doing it either less than it needs to bring inflation down, or in order to and end that monetary tightening too quickly, because of course they're worried of what, as I said, of a danger of a recession and of problems in the financial system, but in that case running the risk that inflation will just go on rising. So we find an administration which is in a corner, a president who is in a corner and who senses that everything around him is falling apart.
Right. So listening to you, you say, do they raise interest rates? Do they perhaps push the U.S. towards a recession by doing so? And then I was just thinking to myself as you were talking, and I said, do they start a war as a distraction? Do they start this fake war, this glamour war, as you called it, as a distraction? I mean, they're so desperate and they're in such a corner. The key thing to all of this is that this is 100% Biden's doing.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of people that are going to try to distract away from Biden. I mean, you'll hear it all the time. Oh, well, this started under Trump, and, this was his presidency that led up to where we are today. This is Biden's doing. These were his decisions that put the U.S. into this position.
Absolutely. Let's be absolutely clear about this. It is Biden's decision. And we can say that with authority, because on the Duran, last year, after his inauguration, after Biden started his massive spending programs, we said on the Duran that it would result in higher inflation. We were not the only people to say it. I mean, people like Larry Summers, for heaven's sake, were saying it. But all sorts of people were warning at the time, there's no need to start overspending in this fashion. The economy is recovering strongly. There's no need to pour further stimulus on an already recovering economy. All that will do is it will create bottlenecks and pressures on the economy. It will cause the economy to overheat, and the inevitable result of that is higher inflation. All Biden needed to do last year was wait until the recovery gathered pace and started to take on steam and develop under its own momentum. Instead, he overstimulated it because he was told by all sorts of clever people, I put the word clever in inverted commas, all sorts of clever people, that this is his great chance to be the new FDR, the new LBJ, the new JFK. He was going to transform America. He was going to change America. He was going to carry through this great Democratic Party project to remake America. So he went for this massive spending program. And the result is inflation, just as we predicted. And that's put the Federal Reserve Board, which has been, by the way, disastrously accommodating to him. They should have started to raise interest rates last year. They should have started to raise interest rates the moment they saw what he was doing. They should have started to rein back on their QE programs the moment they saw what he was doing. That is what a genuinely, truly independent central bank would have started to do. But of course, they didn't do that. They accommodated him. They went around with this fantasy that inflation would just be temporary, that there'd just be a minor upward blip, the transitory inflation. They all pretended to all of this. And now what they found is that it's in danger of running out of control. So the Fed now has to make this incredibly difficult decision. Do they raise interest rates, risk a recession, and perhaps crisis, or at least a major problems in the financial system, and at the same time scupper the chances of the Democrats in the November midterms, or do they do nothing or too little and see inflation rise even further, which, by the way, will also, in a different way, scupper the Democrats' chances in the November midterms. It is entirely and completely of Biden's own making. The only thing I would say is the Federal Reserve Board, the Fed itself, facilitated him in his follies.
Yeah, well, they're trying to cover for him. I mean, since Biden became president, all we've seen, and even before, that the media has been frantically trying to cover for him. The Fed trying to cover for him. Everyone is trying to cover for his absolute incompetence. And when I mean Biden, I mean the Biden machine. We always have to say that. We don't mean the actual man. We understand that there are people behind the man and people that are actually making the decisions for him. But all these institutions, all they've been doing since the minute he got into office is to try to cover his butt. And it's going from bad to worse to disastrous. You didn't even mention the supply chain shortages, which haven't been resolved, the mandates, which are killing businesses, killing employees, and they're still not resolving them. They're making them worse. For example, you have the mandates now with the truckers and the trade that's going to get affected between Canada and the U.S. You already have trucks which have stopped at the border, and they're saying no chance. We're not going to move products between the two countries because we're not buying into this mandate stuff. I mean, they're not even trying to solve these problems. They're making them worse. This is how bad these guys are.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right, because they don't understand how a modern economy works. And that's not surprising, because these are not people who really have a hands-on understanding of business, of economics. They are ideologues. And because they're ideologues, they pursue ideological agendas. Now, can I say very straight away, I mean, you can have a left-wing agenda, you can have a right-wing agenda, but you can still have that agenda which is based on a firm foundation of economics. You can run an economy properly, and as a result of a growing economy, you've got money to spend. You can do all sorts of things with that money, which, if you're right, if you're politically on the right, you can do them in one way. If you're on the left, you can do them in another way. But these people around Biden, they're not interested in these things. They're not interested ultimately in how an economy works. They have an ideological agenda. They assume that if they follow the ideological agenda, that will in itself mean that everything comes right. And things don't happen like that. You can't work in that way. You can't assume that simply because you think that things will work out in a particular way, they actually will. But that is what they did. And that's why we are where we are. And by the way, I mean, you mentioned the mandates, which are now, of course, falling apart legally. But it isn't just the mandates. I mean, there's been a massive increase, apparently, in regulatory burdens on US businesses. And on top of that, the administration is now working overtime, apparently, to reverse Donald Trump's tax changes. And that, at a time like this, when business is already becoming overextended, is going to add even more pressures on US business and is going to deepen the recessionary forces even more. And again, they don't understand the actual effect of Donald Trump's tax changes, because they continue to imagine that those tax changes were regressive. In other words, that they benefited the super rich at the expense of the poor, whereas in fact the people who most benefited from the tax changes, Donald Trump's work tax changes, were middle class people, working people, and businesses, and middle ranking businesses. So they are undertaking changes which are burdening and weakening the economy even further. And because they have this, they're so ideologically blinkered, they don't understand it.
Yeah. Final question. You think there has to be a recession? Do you think it's baked in?
I have to say, I think this is increasingly likely. Either we have a recession now, or we have an interest, or we have higher inflation. It's going to be one or the other. And of course, the danger is that we're going to get neither fully one nor the other, and we're going to get what is called stagflation, which is a phenomenon that appeared in the 70s, in which the Federal Reserve increases interest rates, but not enough to really put out the inflation fire that Biden has lit. So inflation remains elevated, not perhaps as high as it might go, but still elevated. But the tightening of monetary policy, and combined with the effect of inflation on living standards, means that the economy doesn't really grow and it starts to stagnate. So we could end up with a situation where we either have higher inflation, very high inflation, because the Federal Reserve funks the task of raising interest rates, or we have a recession because the Federal Reserve decides that it has to raise interest rates, or we have stagflation where the Federal Reserve does neither one or the other properly, and we have the situation where the economy booming as it was under Donald Trump, or at least not booming, at least growing as it was under Donald Trump, basically stagnates, as, by the way, it did for most of the time that Barack Obama was president. A fact which most people don't understand. Barack Obama's time as president was a period of stagnation in the economy. And it could very well be that we will end up with exactly the same situation under Biden, but one with more pressure on businesses than was true in Obama's time, higher inflation, higher prices than was true in Obama's time, and even more pressure on living standards than was true in Obama's time. So we could end up with either one of those three scenarios, it seems to me. The one thing we're not going to get between now and the midterms is strong non-inflationary growth. We got that for a short time under Donald Trump. We're not going to get it under Joe Biden.
Yeah. Who would have thought that in Obama's third term, he would outdo himself with better stagflation?
Well,
anyway.
Well, there we are. Yeah. I mean, it seems the master
what more proof do you need as to who's running things?
Who's running things? You have all of these. There we go. I mean, it's who's running these things.
Yeah, exactly. Say you're going to say something. You have all of these?
No, I mean, you have all of these people, all these clever people around Obama and to some extent Biden, who come up with these economic ideas based on misunderstandings of the writings of J.M. Keynes. And unfortunately, Obama, who imagines himself to be a clever man, believes all of this. And as I said, it led to bad consequences when he was president, and it's going to lead to worse ones this time.
Yeah, that it will. All right, we'll leave it there. The Duran.locals.com, ODYSEE, BitChute, Rumble, and Super U, and 10% off Duran Shop merch when you use the code GOODDAY, as in that mug. All right, take care.